you everyone for sticking with us till the end. We are going to be talking about alliances and how that will help us in cybersecurity. I am Jeff Green. I run the cyber programs for the Aspen Digital Program, part of the Aspen Institute. Our panel also has become accidentally one about resilience, a theme from earlier today. Two of our panelists, Cecilia Bohnfeld-Dahl and Marina Ciaran, experienced some of the travel difficulties I think that others are feeling in Europe. But with that spirit of resilience, we have persevered and have an excellent panel. I'm pleased to be joined by Ciaran Martin, Vivian Schiller, I should remember her name, she's my boss, and Claudia Gherman from Digital Europe. So folks here I'm sure know Ciaran well. He is currently a professor of practice at the Blavatnik School of Government at the Oxford University and a managing director at Paladin Capital. From 2014 to 2020, he stood up and led the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, capping off 23 years of service to the United Kingdom. Vivian Schiller is the executive director of Aspen Digital, which focuses on cyber, emerging technology, and information ecosystems, and has long experience at the intersection of journalism, technology, having held positions at CNN, New York Times, NPR, Twitter, and more. She also was there at the creation, the early thinking of the Aspen Global Cyber Group, of which Ciaran is a charter member. Marina Ciaran is one of our co-chairs, and Cecilia Bohnfeld-Dahl is one of our members as well. Finally, Claudia is with Digital Europe, where she leads a work stream on digital resilience, and we'll talk a bit about a paper that she just published on cyber defense policy in Europe. I'm going to start off, though, by filling a little bit of Marina's shoes. I want to give a very brief overview of that Aspen Global Cyber Group because I think that speaks to the issue of alliances and how we need to work across sectors and across countries on cybersecurity issues. This is a group that was stood up in 2022. We had our first meeting in Prague in November. We have members from 35 different countries and are hopeful to be continuing to go forward. We have three great co-chairs. Marina, who I mentioned, a member of the European Parliament, former foreign minister of Estonia, David Coe, who is the chairman of the Singapore Cybersecurity Agency, and then Corey Thomas of the cybersecurity company Rapid7. Like all Aspen programs, this will be very much member-driven. We hope to bring together some of the best experts so we can collectively identify and then provide solutions to some of the pressing problems we have right now. But I want to start with Ciaran, and I'd ask you to put your government hat back on. And as you would sit and be part of or listen to programs like this or take input from outside groups, how can advisory groups, think tanks, if you will, provide the best service to governments? Are there things that we can do, that they can do that are best received? Are there some horror stories you have, perhaps, of how advice landed poorly? What's the best way to engage so we can bridge the public-private divide and now, particularly importantly, the global divide between countries?
Thanks very much, Jeff. Well, I've got loads of horror stories, but I think in one sentence, the answer to how to make an impact is to have an answer to the question, what do we do with this? First of all, thanks to everybody for staying. Thanks to my co-panelists for stepping in. I thought I was being boycotted or no platformed or something because I was the only original member.
We call it cancelled in the United States.
Yeah. There's all sorts of new words to this, but so thank you for that. I think if you go back 10 years, I think there was a real problem in global cybersecurity with an orthodoxy without any substance. Everybody would tell you the answer was information sharing and public-private partnerships. And it took me about a year in my cybersecurity job to figure out, well, yeah, fine, but what are we doing? And there was endless committees and so forth. There was just absolutely no substance to it. We were trying the same thing over and over again. When it wasn't working, we just shout it louder and tell people to do it. And then you would get reports saying, you know, we should do more information sharing and more public-private partnerships. So the absolutely critical thing is to have some substance to it. We started off with industry groups. You know, it was not a strategic solution to any problem, but it was proof of concept and it did some good. So we started partnering with an industry group that would automate requests for known malicious websites to get them taken down. And they started to tumble down. Then their hang times, the amount of time they were up, started to tumble. It was a little bit of positive good. And also it got people, it got government and industry groups thinking, actually, there are bits of this problem set that we can do. So just sort of mapping out little bits. I think, you know, so for I think also you need a little bit of bureaucracy to follow it up. So I think it is good to have formal standing groups that can say, look, we need to do this. When you have international cooperation, and a good example is the US-led ransomware task force. I was really cynical about it. I thought, here we go again. It's going to be another sort of report. Then they said, right, okay, Australia, you do that bit. You know, can you lead the anti-cryptocurrency bit? And again, things started to happen. So there's a bit about having some structure to it rather than just declarations. There is a thing I think about, you know, and groups like Aspen can help with this, is about encouraging people to create the right environment. I mean, in things like that, in terms of encouraging people to take the odd risk. If people start litigating when the government does something unusual and companies start collaborating, it's game over. And you know, you can't take away their right to litigate, but you can actually say, look, there's essentially a code here. If you want to work between government and industry, at the first sign of a legal letter, we're done. Right? And again, you know, there are things about how do you bring people together to build that trust. And the final point, which I thought came out really powerfully in Lisa Monaco's contribution just now, is about using groups like this, you know, actual government-sponsored groups or private groups to enhance the transparency of this, because otherwise you just get into mistrust. So the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Pentagon, who's here, I thought was really, really good on this yesterday about, look, if we're going to get cyber risk right in the context of the war in Ukraine, we have to present accurately what's actually been happening. Otherwise we're off chasing shadows. I endorse entirely what Lisa said about the Cloud Act and so forth. And we need to just take time, if you're going to make these interventions, to bring people with you. So, you know, so for me, in summary, the most important thing is some concrete action arising from these things, a little bit of bureaucratic capability, a little bit of willingness to take a risk, and a willingness to engage people in it.
Great, thanks, Ciaran. Vivian, having been there at the creation of a new group, working with Marina, Tony Verstandig, and others, can you talk a bit about why you thought it was necessary? You know, you were it was in the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion. And can you also assure Ciaran that you were not working on a report on the need for information sharing?
Yeah. God forbid. And Ciaran, who is part of our group, oh, I guess I should pick up my mic. Ciaran, who is part of our group, was not able to join us in the first meeting, but will for the second, is going to keep us honest on this. So we have as you well know, we have a U.S. cybersecurity group, and we deal, of course, with international issues. But our hypothesis going in, and I'll talk in a minute about how that played out, was that there was a need for a group that was specifically focused on transnational issues, sort of grounded in two very related truths, that cybersecurity is borderless and that technology and security ecosystem is global, something everybody in this room and everybody listening knows. So from that, the idea was, therefore, could we create the hypothesis, is there a need for an international, multilateral, private-public group that can actually get stuff done, to put it colloquially, and not just pronounce that there's a need for public-private partnership and information sharing is key. And I'm happy to say that based on our first meeting, the hypothesis of whether there was a need was confirmed tenfold. And the enthusiasm for the group that something like this really doesn't exist, and the need to actually make sure that that actionable outcomes result from it was resounding. As Jeff said, it's very important that it's member-led. This is not Aspen's view of the world. It is about the collective wisdom of this extraordinary group of people that we've brought together.
Thanks, Vivian. Claudia, I know that you just worked on a paper on cyber defense in Europe. Can you talk a little bit about the high-level recommendations that came out of it, and also maybe talk a little bit about how that envisions the private sector as part of the solution to the cybersecurity problems we face today?
I'll bring the European English to this panel. So indeed, our recent paper on cyber defense actually is part of a wider effort at Digital Europe, and Digital Europe is the leading trade association for digitally transforming industries in Europe. And part of this as a response to the situation in Ukraine, we put together a digital resilience executive council, which brings which pulls together expertise from our members, senior executives, senior experts, and they came together because their role is to recommend some actions to governments, and they basically put forward a couple of recommendations across 4 areas. Governance, then procurement, standards, and skills. And as we heard yesterday, I think it was Minister Gerlach who said, we don't know who to call in case we have a major cyber incident. And I think that's also part of, that's the view of some other people. And so our recommendation on governance was to set up an advisory council, bringing together the public and the private sides on digital resilience, and to look at how we can ensure that we have the right skills, the standards that we need, and also an agile and fast procurement, especially for SMEs, because they are the ones facing quite a lot of problems. And just to zoom in a bit on the advisory council, the role of the advisory council is actually to facilitate and to address strategic cooperation and preparedness to achieve a high level of network and information security in Europe. And part of this, and part of your question on private and also the alliances like Aspen Digital, is to take into consideration the expertise, the ideas from alliances such as Aspen Digital, and bring this back, feed this back into what we're doing in this group. And yeah, I think it's a wonderful occasion to catalyze all these ideas and solutions so we can push forward for action.
Great, thanks. Picking up on a bit on your earlier comments in the Ukraine thread, yesterday Sandra Joyce talked about Mandiant's support to Ukraine in the run-up and as that war began, and that is something of a new construct of public-private partnership, of private companies engaged with nations as they are attacked. Vivian, I know that Aspen just recently published a paper that actually, by some of our members, looking at support that they provided to Ukraine in the immediate run-up to and after. Wondering if you could share some findings. And then, Ciaran, if you could wear both your hats, both from your perspective as recently departed government, what are your thoughts on that brand of private support when it is a shooting war in the kinetic sense? And then, from the private sector side, you have 2 interesting perspectives on these companies who are engaged with actual combatants.
Yeah, I made note of Sandra's comment yesterday about the role of the private sector in the defense of Ukraine. And in fact, we released a paper yesterday that was co-authored by Jeff Brown here in the room from Recorded Future, Greg Rattray, and also Taj Moore from the Aspen group, that was really focused on, it was a report about a coalition, this again, not theory, but actual results of a coalition of private sector companies who came together to support the cybersecurity defense of Ukraine, both pre and post the beginning of the pre and post invasion. So I would encourage you, I point you to that report. You can find it on our website. It has a lot of data, but I think the most interesting part is that cyber must be part of any defensive plan. And I was at a breakfast meeting earlier where Clint Watts made the really important point that we should stop using the term hybrid war. It's just war. Hybrid, it's all, we've got to completely change that definition. And so that is certainly the case in point with Ukraine. I think the other important thing to take from this paper, I won't go into all of the details of what it presents, you can read it for yourself, is that this is a good test case for us to hone these practices now in advance of other impending conflicts. In some ways, the Ukraine war, I would never use the word easy, but the war in Ukraine, it's very, very clear-cut. One country invaded the sovereign nation of another territory. Their acts have been absolutely, documented and horrendous. There are good guys and bad guys here, and it's sort of easier for a coalition to come together. That's not always going to be that clear-cut in future conflicts. They will be much more complicated, and so trying to see what we can learn from the conflict in Ukraine and from these efforts is going to be really critical.
Very little to add to that. Excellent answer. But just on the Ukraine context, I mean, lest it be thought that in my first answer I was sort of trashing information sharing and public-private partnerships, it's what I'm trashing is those concepts with nothing underpinning them. And Ukraine is a really good example of where there's substance. And I think some really interesting lessons. So I think it accelerated some things that governments had been doing tentatively. So, I gave one example earlier of us trying to clean up digital environments through dodgy websites. There were examples on the information sharing side where we would get voluntarily some really good stuff from cybersecurity companies. We'd give it to banks and it would see off North Korean cash heists. And then, but there were always issues, there were always barriers and blockades. And then the Ukraine situation came along, as Vivian said, completely morally unambiguous and strategically important. And people had a different risk appetite. They said, right, we're going to do this. What's the permissions? We don't have time for that. We just need to do this, right? And sort of nobody complained. The private sector played a really good role. Some of it was basic, just put in some DDoS protection at some vulnerable facility, all the way through to really skillful, high-impact stuff like cloud migration. Companies, including many in this room, played an absolutely critical role. So for me, there's sort of what I'd call, coming from that, is what I might call the British vaccine question. What I mean by that is, there's a debate in the UK at the minute. One of the few things the UK has done really well at sort of governmental level in the last few years has been the development and rollout of the vaccine. And it did it by breaking all its rules in a way that is unsustainable outside of an emergency. You can't go around saying to people, right, you can do this really imaginative thing and money is no object. You can't do that all the time, but that's essentially what you did. But there were things in terms of the way in which the UK handled vaccination production and distribution really well. There are things that can apply outside of an emergency. And I think a really interesting discussion in the long term, whenever this awful conflict finally comes to some sort of conclusion, is what bits of the cyber defense of Ukraine, where we broke probably quite a lot of rules, or at least conventions and understandings, to accelerate the mobilization of public and private capability rapidly. We shared information for a purpose really, really rapidly. What bits of that can actually transfer outside of a crisis situation, I think would be a really, really interesting thing to discuss at Aspen and elsewhere.
Yeah, and as we think about future conflicts, the economic consequences will potentially be much more significant, that will force different risk calculation, risk analysis. Before I go to the audience, one quick question for the three of you. From my perspective, having gone to university during the Cold War and studying it as it ended, Europe and the US, as a result, I think, of this conflict, are as unified in some ways as we have been since then. Yet there are tensions. We saw President Macron not thrilled with the CHIPS Act. Others in Europe, obviously, there's pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act and investment in the United States which have caused tension. Thoughts on where that puts the alliance going forward? Are these just normal squabbles between siblings or friends? Or are there things that we need to do to reset to make sure that when this awful conflict ends, we can keep this spirit of unity going forward?
I dare to say that they are only squabbles between friends, because indeed, there is a bit of tendency of protectionism on both sides of the Atlantic, and more tension, I would say, on the trade and maybe financial side. But at the same time, we see that on the security side, there's more alignment. And as a matter of fact, it was yesterday, Mrs. Spanu, she said that, well, we've seen a lot of cooperation in the past couple of years between the EU and US. And the EU-US cyber dialogues, of which we are a part, is a testimonial in that sense, and not to mention the cooperation under the umbrella of NATO. And as a matter of fact, us, as Digital Europe, we are part of the high-level forum on standardization, and they're looking at digital resilience as well, digital amongst other things. And that's also an area where we see the possibility of more discussions with the US counterparts. So yeah, a bit of a squabble.
I'll just answer briefly. So the area that I focus on and know best is information ecosystems and information warfare and information operations. Interesting dynamic between the US and Europe there that is not necessarily something that people say out loud, but it's widely known, is that because of the for a whole bunch of reasons, any kind of regulation or legislation in the United States around the information ecosystem is not going to happen anytime soon in the foreseeable future. The EU, though, has taken the lead there, and I think there are more than one American who believe that this is in many ways very helpful, because where the U.S. is either cannot or will not act, the baton goes to Europe, and it's not just, those regulations are not just about what happens in Europe for European citizens, but they are worldwide. So there's sort of an interesting trade there.
2 points very quickly. There is a squabble aspect to this, as Laura said. I think there's also a point about we have to rethink the way we cooperate on these issues. So if you're into defense cooperation, and I would include traditional cybersecurity cooperation in this, we know how to do it. We may not always do it well, but we have the institutions and the mechanisms for doing it. So, you know, Russia invades Ukraine, NATO gets together, it has a summit, actions remitted to 30 national capitals, to the NATO central bureaucracy, stuff happens. You have a discussion about how to keep free and open technology in the face of Chinese competition, as you did at the G7 in 2021. The US, the EU, the other members of the G7 make a very resounding declaration. There's no mechanisms for following that up because, and this is nobody's fault, we're designed to compete. This is economics. We're designed in free market economies not to cooperate about this stuff. And if you look at, you know, the roots of the 5G controversy, it was the lack of an industrial base because, you know, we'd been out-competed and out-cheated by China whilst we were playing by free market rules. So it's a really hard question. How do you do economic, you know, how do you have this dialogue when you have aligned strategic security interests, but you want free and open competition between companies? So that's one part that we need to rethink, in my view. And the second point, but I think where the EU and or Europe as a continent and the US will have common interests as well, is whatever happens at the end of this awful conflict. And in the narrow, and as Dmitry Volperovich was saying, you know, it's in the grand scheme of the horrors, it isn't that big a deal, but it's important in our world. I think there's no scenario in which the Russia-Ukraine landmass and surrounding areas are not a continuing source of digital instability, you know, an area where people can hang out and commit large-scale cybercrime and so on. What does that mean for us? Well, how do we go about getting ahead of that problem, and planning for dealing with it is an interesting topic, again, for public-private partnership, for EU-US collaboration.
Thanks. Sure.
Just to build on that. The war in Ukraine was quite of a wake-up call for Europe that we need to boost our our capabilities as well, and our own resilience on this side. And I'm a Romanian, so in our country, this is of significance what happened in Ukraine, and of course it raises some concerns. And I think it's not a bad thing in itself, the squabbles between the US and the EU, if they lead to our better preparation, well, for other potential incidents. Let's not go into a darker scenario.
Yeah, great point. We have time for one question, I think, if there's one in the crowd. We have worn the group out. So I will ask one last quick question. Vivian talked about the impact of European policy and regulation on the U.S. I'm wondering if there's any thought as the U.S. prepares its national cyber strategy, and Kemba Walden talked yesterday about lifting and shifting potential liability. To Vivian's point, the reality of that law passing in the U.S. is low. I'm wondering from a European perspective, do you have any sense that the EU or others are looking at what the U.S. policy says and then perhaps can move forward with that in a way that could drive global policy forward, perhaps in that area of shifting liability away from individuals and perhaps the manufacturers? Do you see that as a possibility here? Ciaran or Claudia, that may be in your zone.
just very quickly, Claudia referred to squabbles, but look, and there will be tensions, but we'll always have our eyes on the US. What happens in the US in cybersecurity is absolutely central to everything, for good or bad. But it is the indispensable ally in our cybersecurity as in our wider security. And I think all of us Europeans should remember that. And it's great that so many US partners have been here. I'm quite excited about the pending strategy. It won't fulfill everybody's ambitions and expectations, but I think it sounds like it's shaping up to a really important moment, not just for the US, but for global cybersecurity.
Claudia, do you think the strategy could impact activity in Europe on the policy standpoint, particularly in that liability space?
Definitely, I would say so. And as a matter of fact, I don't remember exactly the speaker from yesterday, but they were saying like what is happening in the US is absolutely fascinating, like the developments on the cyber security side and cyber resilience. So yeah, my answer would be yes, definitely.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for your time today. Thank you, everyone, for staying and for the opportunity to be here. I wish everyone safe and hopefully easy travel over the next day. So thank you.